Welcome everyone to YouTube Masterclass. My name is Sheley. I'm Dr. Sheley. I'm a professor adjunct at Masterclass for USC, Calarts, and Harvard, and those schools are connected in these kind of like big decision making of the rest of academia, and like especially when it comes to film and everything. Harvard doesn't really have a film program. That perhaps will develop it. We can't talk about it for a while, but we'll see what happens. And the reason that's on the books is because more interesting things can happen with this class. Like recently, USC rendered it that on the internet that I was adjunct professor for them and teaching Orson Welles, and we don't have to go through these like adulations or anything. I'm not expecting that, dude, because I made it by skin of my teeth. It's good to be there, but this is a class that we're dedicated to, and I'm dedicated to for how long it takes to get through it, because there's a lot of material. So if you don't want to take this class, you don't have to. If something I say offends you, don't take the class if it really offends you, because it doesn't offend me. And I might say it again, and it might offend you. Don't worry about that. That's just like the technicalities. If you understand what's in the lecture on Coursera, then like the remote teaching can make more sense, because I know that there's a lot of students out there that would like to audit a class like this or pick up units from these classes, and then you can take Coursera and watch the classes online is where this originates, although it's a YouTube masterclass. I'm not going to tell you. It was a long intro, but there's this thing like Lady from Shanghai is like, it's funny because it's the only Orson Welles film I could find, but I had bought them all. And I'm not saying like they won't come back, because like other movies of mine have come back, like my animation came back. It's like I shouldn't talk about that because now it's like I'll be guarding it. No, I'm kidding. So I'm just saying like, well, so the truth about Orson Welles, where were we? Magnificent Emerson ends kind of a little bit after the big Studebaker car Ford, like pop can thing that went down the road. When it slides off on the ice and everybody kind of falls off and shit, they all go to the hospital and they lay down in these beds, and they're like in hospital beds. And you're kind of wondering if they got sick from like getting hypothermia, because like they were talking about that early in the movie, that they might catch hypothermia in all this cold winter. And I was like, well, that's kind of sad, because at the end, they never get out of the beds cured before the movie ends. And the one ending that's interesting in a movie that Orson Welles really liked was the ending of Greed. And we've talked about that time and again, because the Greed ending is like the ultimate shocking, like final conclusion of all things Greed at the end, dude. I mean, the ending saves it all for like the last 5 seconds, and then you're like, it's worse than Canterbury Tales, I'm telling you. Like, in a good way. Because it's like, you don't know that the final frame of the film blows your mind in a movie like that. So Orson Welles would always stick these like shocking things at the end of his movies, and he always he did the shocking ending. Like Hitchcock did the apocalyptic ending, where just everybody kills everybody and it's free for all, zombies everywhere, But like the cinema of Orson Welles is very independent in that it shows us how to make a film even better than you could say D.W. Griffith used to do. Because really Orson Welles can capture a moment in time and make it artifice and make it brilliant realism in this way of like focusing on it and making it a long framed rectangle in the theaters, hopefully, to see it. And like, if it's not hopefully, it's because the classical era used a box like this. And if you look at Citizen Kane, it's in 1941. And this is around the time of Sullivan's Travels, and there were movies coming out by Preston Sturges that were comedies that were like really making it big in the box office. And one thing that's cool about Orson Welles is, even though he didn't always work in the commercial genre, he sometimes took not only parts for movies, but he worked in like all the studios helping with different things in cinema. So and a lot of directors do this. Like they take on roles throughout that are like everybody's different kind of category of what they prefer about film and etc. So Rita Hayworth saying this with Orson Welles, and they still sell commercially. That they sell commercially to these big companies is not how they originally made it, but that Columbia did put money into it is interesting because Citizen Kane really got it from King Kong. King Kong in 1933 with RKO doing so much money. And RKO, you know, it's interesting because when it closed, all of its movies solidified, and King Kong was still like so big on box office that like the stock market on RKO is like extremely high because it's so rare. Like people forget rarity is a collector's example of what you want. If it's new and rare, it's worth, you know, a collector's item. You know, so if it's rare, that means it's probably older than today's date, or it's like foreign film or whatever, and that's why you collect them, you know, because they're valuable. They're valuable, and they really cost like a third or a fraction of the part that it would cost to make one of these. You know, like to make like not the movie, but the distribution in today's mind is what I'm getting at. Like I understand Orson Welles is still popular now. We consider Citizen Kane like after King Kong is another King Kong. Like he even has that big picture of him, and he's kind of acting like he's, you know, on top of the world, and he's on the microphone, and he's telling everybody this and that, and then like this guy, the governor's sitting out in front, and he's like about to like call him out. And so, like, Magnificent Ambersons doesn't have that level of conflict, really, in certain senses, but in certain senses, there's some macabre type humor that kind of always comes with the territory. You know, because, like, they weren't, like, acting out a later movie they were going to be in, but Joseph Cotten was in Citizen Kane, and he went with them to Magnificent Ambersons, and he's in many others of the Orson Welles movies, and he's one of the Mercury players. Now, the Mercury players were the ones that worked for Orson Welles at RKO in the radio at first, and then with Houseman, and then with, well, back and forth between those two, you know, because they worked for both. And The Lady of Shanghai is not the next film we're talking about. We're actually talking about one called The Stranger, because it comes after Magnificent Ambersons, and there really isn't a connection film to film at the ending so much, because they skip years, they skip places, they skip where it's set, and they skip how they tell the story. So it's all there, but you don't really pay attention to how it's manifesting, though we said it's innuendo for filmmaking, that The Stranger is objective, subjective logic is one thing that I've got to tell you about. Because objective, subjective logic is where the material plasticity creates a way to hold in everything that's within that space that's an object. And the camera is the subject that focuses or centers on whatever that object is. And if that object is another subject, then it would be a human being. So if a subject sits here, just imagine with me, the subject sits here, then the objective is here with this subject and this object, and that's something that holds everything into one space. All the particles are together, you know, it's great to learn about, because with a camera you can hinge around something that you couldn't normally do. Like our eyes are not like curved quite like a lens to capture the same kind of picture, but we can see things in a way that are almost better than pictures. But I think pictures have finally caught up to like how we see the real world. And that's an irony, because most of the directors that were trying to do that were long ago and weren't like, they were always testing realism's endurance, you know. And Orson Welles will test the endurance of realism. He will. I mean, like, even Magnificent Ambersons all the way. I mean, it slows down and just, like, keeps slowing down, you know? And you're like, you don't want it to stop slowing down. And you're just like, I like when this movie just gets peaceful and calm and then everybody rips on each other and has a car accident. No, I'm kidding. An accident, you know? And it's like, that's kind of a glib way to say it. But if you look at, like, The Stranger, it's kind of a strange film because Stranger in a Strange Film. Because he finds out that, like, some dude's a Nazi, and then he battles with him, and then the Nazi battles with him. He's like a professor, okay? Orson Welles. He's playing a professor in this movie, his third movie after Magnificent Ambersons. And this was at RKO again. And it was also, Warner Brothers later bought the rights to these movies, you know. That's what I was confused about. And this one's Columbia Classics. I mean, that might be that's probably distribution, you know. And, well, Orson Welles was in The Stranger, and so he's chasing this Nazi around. There's like this Nazi loose in the high rise. And he's like one of the employees in a bank, and so he's going to go stop the Nazi. And it's the weirdest movie because he's like climbing this ladder, and he finally like throws him off the top. And like, I don't know if he lives or dies, nobody does, but it's like, sorry he killed him, and then he goes back to work and everything's fine. And I thought that reminded me of The Trial because like he's in there getting busted for nothing he's done. And all these people come piling in The Trial by Kafka that Orson Welles will do later from The Stranger, and The Trial has them like looking around for the guy, the only man in society who has done no crimes. And so that gets really scary about The Trial because the less he does to break the law, the more the law comes after him. And it's like this really, I don't know how to explain that exactly, because that's kind of one of those attraction repulsion type things where it's like you go for it, but you're not quite sure if you should, but you want to. And then that's what happens really in all of Orson Welles' movies about desire, because there's this whole like big romantic thing about making everything, you know, huge and edible, and these situations are like mythic, like there's like a cult and witchcraft that goes out to Orson Welles. I mean, there's people that chant his name in the sky, you know, there's people that worship him like he's this demigod. And like that's okay because when Citizen Kane was his first movie, nobody can really overplay how important a movie is for them or is for cinema. You know, nobody can overplay that because every movie is important to cinema. Doesn't matter, but this is the father of independence. Other than like Buster Keaton, he was an independent. Charlie Chaplin was an independent, but Orson Welles was the next independent of the sound era because everybody else always worked directly for the studio, and Orson Welles always worked outside the studio. And even with Touch of Evil, which as a universal picture, it's like, it probably, and I know there was a universal release of it, but there could have been other studio releases of the old classical films. That's one thing that's confusing, because sometimes they signed on more than one studio and gave them the same movie, but they're a little bit different through studio to studio. And that's okay because, like, it's not really a version thing. It's more like these are movies that we have re-added things to that we've restored. And it's like whenever you hear that something's been re-added, you get kind of dubious and you're like, I think that may reflect on my opinion or not, you know, that I don't think that should be there. It should. But Orson Welles is independent director. He calls his own shots. He calls his own walk. And he calls his own talk, you know. I mean, like he's got class in Citizen Kane, even though it all falls apart and it crashes and he loses everything and they go down in flames and everything gets ruined, and at the end it's the shock ending where he falls down the stairs. We saw it at the beginning of the movie, Citizen Kane. And then you get to The Stranger, and it's the same kind of surrealism as even Magnificent Ambersons. It's like there's this misty fog over The Stranger. Like he's this Irish guy again, and he's Irish in Lady from Shanghai. And it's like in The Stranger, the third one, I don't really understand why he's chasing the Nazi in the first place. Like it was like an old silent film or something. You can't figure it out, but it's a 1930s sound film. I'm like, why is he chasing the Nazi? And then I thought, well, World War II, maybe that was it, but not necessarily, because Orson Welles wasn't really like into the war that much. Like he didn't really like combat or anything, but he made war movies. Like he's in the movie Catch 22. And I don't really think that I'm like legendizing Orson Welles not only for being in that movie, but that he is one of the main characters and he's the sergeant of the whole group doesn't mean that in real life he's a bad guy. Because he plays these bad guys in these movies, but like from what they knew about him at the time is that he was actually a pretty nice guy, but that he plays these arch villains, you know. And that you're like, well, if an arch villain turns out to be a villain, that's cool. And if he doesn't, well, you know, he's not an arch villain. Then no, I'm kidding. But like, you don't think of Orson Welles as like the corrupter in ways. He's corrupter of the medium, only that he took it to a new height. He took everything, and since it's independent, he took everything that like Buster Keaton was doing and like wrapped it up as serious. It's like this big shot across the vista, and it's got things like the modernity of Touch of Evil in it, like the car explosion in the 11-minute opening sequence, 8-minute opening sequence of Touch of Evil, you know. And the stranger's so surreal because you're like, well, he chases this Nazi, he doesn't catch him, he's kind of glad he doesn't. And I'm going, this movie's really strange, why would he even go after him? And then it's like, it's all spooky, and then like, the Nazi comes back and like almost gets him, and then he chases him again. And I thought, did these guys just chase each other around in this building, or am I missing an important part in history, or is this something that like really refers to me at all? But at the same time, this was kind of cool. He's chasing a Nazi. I don't know where this is gonna go. And I'm not trying to be glib about that because it's a weird movie. It's like, this is kind of a B movie for Orson Welles. It's like RKO gives him less of a budget because Magnificent Ambersons doesn't exactly gross the highest score that it needs to recover what it costs to make, considering they built like those houses and everything. They built those big mansions for the movie. And so it's like that they made that's cool because then they can use it later, supposedly, right? Like Orson Welles isn't like scrapping it, running away. He's like, well, it's a beautiful monument to Magnificent Ambersons, you know, on Mercury Radio. So it's really cool. But then The Stranger is kind of this laid bare, like low budget, kind of like, why is he chasing the Nazi kind of movie? And it's weird because in the trial, the Nazis come after him. I mean, everybody comes after him in the trial. And at this time, it's Anthony Perkins instead of Orson Welles playing it, but it's Orson Welles directing. So in the trial that Anthony Perkins gets faced with, like, all kinds of, like, subgroups and subcults, and even things we've said, there are those that, like, lift up society and those that deteriorate society, and there's those that do both. And I think that deterioration of society is part of symptomatic of like Orson Welles type of corruption, where it says we're all just gonna like crash somewhere in outer space and we'll end up there and we'll be lost on the planet, and it'll be like Forbidden Planet, and the future will come true, and it'll be like we're all prophets. And then, you know, he does this speech 3 times in his career. Like he does it when he's talking at War of the Worlds, and then he explains War of the Worlds in the 50s, and then one more time before he dies, hauntingly enough, in the 70s, he gave another War of the Worlds marathon. And in all of them, there were people panicking because he was telling them to. And then he was like, oh, by the way, this is a cover-up. And I was like, I'm not really doing this. And like, everybody's like, oh man, I killed Aunt Bessie. I hope that's okay, everybody. War of the Worlds was on, you know? And I'm kind of making that glib, but it's like, War of the Worlds was on and people were really shooting each other over aliens. That's not really to make fun of. Because there really are aliens that shoot at people. And you can make fun of me for saying that. There's aliens that shoot people sometimes. I've seen it in movies, and there really are in outer space aliens that shoot at us. So there you have my opinion on it. That's why it's so controversial to have an alien on the movie, because we know it's real. ghosts, I'm not so sure if they're real. I've seen them. But, and I'm only bragging because Orson Welles is this kind of magicianry of the hand that played one side and dropped in the other. It's a drop because he's now coming to the stranger and things aren't really falling apart like they did at the end of Citizen Kane, where everything crashes when the movie's starting to bomb out and crash and overwork its size, and then Magnificent Amberson really overworks its size, and that these are big films for just like only his second film. And then he comes to The Stranger, and it's like we're sitting there going, did I just watch a newsreel about like Germany or something? I don't get that. Orson Welles, could you play it backwards and this time have and it's like, well, I don't know, because it doesn't really have this message, this anti-Nazi message, because the guy that chases him, that Orson Welles plays, is kind of obsessed with him. Like, he's kind of obsessed with him to the point that he's, stalking him. So really, that he's coming to kill him doesn't, strike me as heroic. And it doesn't strike me as heroic anyway, because he wouldn't want to kill a Nazi necessarily, considering, he's probably in good favor with him. In the movie, so that he's becoming this anti-Nazi spy kind of thing isn't exactly it, because he never gets his spy license, and he's kind of an amateur spy in the movie. This isn't in real life, This is in the trial, and not the trial, The Stranger, and I keep forgetting that name because it's nothing like the Camus Stranger. It's nothing like the Camus Stranger, because that one has a guy, an Arab that goes to the beach, and he shoots this guy for no reason and leaves. And then he talks about it for the rest of the book, and then he somehow gets killed. And that's the original Stranger. This Stranger is like Orson Welles, kind of training to be a spy, takes down Nazi henchmen, and saves the school somehow that he professors at. It's a weird story. It's like one of those stories you would never predict in a million years. You would never predict it in a million years, because, how does he even frame something so, almost mundane to be so exciting, but then that he's chasing a Nazi around the building? Why doesn't he catch him within the whole length of the movie? Those questions are never answered. Why exactly it's an hour and a half of a movie? I'm not bagging on the film, because it's kind of fun to watch. It's sort of this, I'm going to bag a Nazi, and here's how I'm going to do it. And it's well, I don't really think that, they were going for that necessarily. I just think it was a coincidence at the time that they were all different, political parties. But that Orson Welles was obviously a Democrat, and then he's a more democratic kind of director, leads him into this kind of revolutionary progression that didn't come with the sustained kind of warlike frenzy of these other generations before him. And they're good, but there's always some kind of war that destroys everybody, and Orson Welles does have a war that destroys everybody in his movies. Like I said, he plays in Catch-22. So let's furthermore say that The Trial, for instance, has this sort of existential motif. And then you look back on Welles, and you're he must have really been into some movies like Devil Probably, and later on in his life, because that didn't come out till 1977, and he died in 1982. So he said it was the greatest, the Bresson film was the greatest experience he ever had. And this is because Bresson is this existentialist, and this is the culmination of his existentialism. But if Orson Welles has it, it's to critique the human nature of mankind and kind of open up this process of saying this is how mankind relates to the world, not just psychologically, but even again politically, And Orson Welles explores these politics through theatrical plays. When Citizen Kane has the dancers in the background, there's a play going on here, and then he's up here playing a character. But we forget that he's a character because we see the play going on in the background, and we think he's a real dude. It's part of the suspension of disbelief. And when you see the background, and you see the foreground and it makes you actually believe that someone is who the movie's saying they are, is one of those movie magic tricks that I can't even begin to explain how they do. You know, I mean, that's so elaborate that like Orson Welles is kind of behind these motifs and like late motifs of building a sort of montage just for like the Agnes Moorehead characters, or like building a montage for like the other films within like The Trial and Touch of Evil have these like moments that there's like montage, Touch of Evil, and Third Man, for instance, by Carol Reed, has some of those pictures that come out and they're like single file photographs in the middle of a film, and they're like, you know, this sort of war wreckage yet again. And so now we've hit around minute 25. We're going to go on for the class is only half over. So if you need to catch your breath, pause it here, catch your breath, and then come back, and I'll be here in a minute. All right, so we got all these movies from Orson Welles that we can study today. And there's all these like textbooks that focus on Orson Welles, and really David Bordwell writes a lot about him in History of Film Style. And in History of Film Style, he says that Welles is like, if you had Fouillard and Griffith, maybe not, but if you had Renoir only, you could still probably get to sort of like Hitchcock and Welles. And the point of that is these directors kind of have like this genealogy. It's the one genealogy I don't mind. Because you have like the beginning filmmakers here like Oscar Micheaux and D.W. Griffith, and he's passed on their knowledge to like John Porton. He's like passed it on. And like Jean Renoir directed these movies in France that were all like American ideals in them, like romantic American ideals, when those were popular, like during the Jazz Age and all the way until the Third Reich blew up the world, you know. And this is like what all The Stranger is leading up to. And so, you know, everything's going on that like is leading up to this war already by the 30s, because now Warner Brothers, they have Confessions of a Nazi Spy in 1939. They're already warning us that the Nazis are like, you know, going to war against us. And so, you know, it's like the propaganda machine was okay, except like everyone sides with us attitude works anywhere you go in the world. Like, and that's where I'm not trying to bag anybody, but you go anywhere, when they actually own the place, they act like they're the only dudes in the world because it's their place, dude. You know, so I'm just saying, like, Orson Welles was very deconstructive towards this kind of like romantic ideal too, because Orson Welles would take these shots and kind of analyze what one would do to the other, not just for hypnosis, but for like psychological satisfaction. And I think there's a certain like line you cross when you're like forcing someone to like see or like something, but they critique that in Citizen Kane, because Joseph Cotton's writing that article. It's like, I don't really like this play, or whatever he writes, you know. I can't believe I don't know those lines memorized, but he's like, write it the way you were going to write it, and so he writes the way he's going to write it, and he writes this film review, and he's totally slamming the Kane character. But again, Orson Welles doesn't really reflect what Charles Foster Kane in the movie really does as performance. You know, it's not the same thing. It's him being that guy, but then he becomes that guy, and then you're like, okay, now he's that guy. And again, when you see in the background that there's dancers and everything in that shot, it really pushes him out as like, not only am I in a movie, you know you're watching a movie, and this is kind of a cool movie because it has me in it and I'm still alive and after I died. You know, and it kind of does this kind of show-off thing throughout, or in a good way, because he gets so carte blanche that he's like, I got to prove it's carte blanche, and he'll have these big dolly shots over the top of a restaurant or whatever, a glass restaurant, and he goes around it and up, and, you know, it's like this really elaborate movie in Magnificent Ambersons with its crane shots. So The Stranger has some cool shots from down here, where it looks up the ladder and he's climbing the ladder. It's weird how many shots there are really of him climbing that ladder, chasing the Nazi all the way up this like bell tower. And I didn't really get why they got into that chase in the first place, because he was kind of sitting there. and then Nazi runs by, and then he goes after him, and you're like, well, if he goes after him, that's a long, like, way up the ladder for him to be an obscure worker in his regular job. I don't really know if that's an avant-garde film, or maybe it is. And maybe it's not at the same time. Maybe it's like something that they've actually reported that had happened by the time of 1942. Because remember, Confessions of a Nazi Spy is before that, is before The Stranger. And there's some other movies that came out in the 40s by Orson Welles. There's other movies by him that came out in the 40s. Some of the ones that he did otherwise for Shakespeare was Macbeth and Othello. And I haven't talked about them in this class, but they're both like really sensitive issues because there's really only like one print of both of them, I think. And they probably have strike more prints as like the years go by. Like, I don't know. They have to come back to it along the way of striking other prints, Everything has to get striked into print so that there's more copies of the film, but not too many copies so that you can easily get like the actual film, but like copies so they could preserve it throughout history. And so Orson Welles is very into this preservation, and that's one of the reasons he uses technique so well. Because his technique is to showcase the Hollywood style of class and genre and like everything rules of the game and everything classy, like I said. And it's like he takes that and combines it with like the train wreck metaphor that everything's going to crash at the end of all the movie and the train goes down and everything explodes at the end. Isn't exactly what happens, but it's about like that. Because really, by the time the shiznit hits the fan in Citizen Kane, you're like, oh, dude. Like, this is all going into a train wreck at the end. And it makes you wonder, kind of, if Orson Welles is really like that at all. And you don't think so because you hear him on the microphone as an everyday, like, common guy. He gets on the microphone and he's like, this is the Mercury Players or whatever. And you're like, well, if he's the Mercury Players, then why is he Citizen Kane too, man? Because it's like, isn't he in the theater? You're like, isn't he in the theater? Like, why can't he do all the parts, I don't know. They like Orson Welles gathers this huge cult following, by the time Citizen Kane, all the smoke clears. Because at first, there were all these guys in Citizen Kane, there's some kind of technical difficulty, but these guys in Citizen Kane were taking parts of the movie and making them psychological and making them like about conditioned response and propagation, like what came from Eisenstein. And the Citizen Kane also involved a big cult following after it came out. Check this. Unlike the other cult followings that came before, this one came out in uproar of like not many of those in Hollywood are sticking up for it at first, but a few days later, recanting and say, we had to see it a second time, and now it's good. Was that planned? Everything with Orson Welles is planned. Everything is, because it's since the dawn of time with Orson Welles. I mean, like, he goes back to the dawn of time. I've seen that planet he becomes. It's the dawn of time. It's the monkey planet. We're going to see the mandala. We're all right. And Orson Welles is going, well, I'm going to make this huge romance and smash it. And that's like the Greed ending, That's like the Hollywood movie that like steps up and goes all the way to the end of the road and fucking falls off, dude. Like, those are the ones that like really blow our minds because they seem so real and yet it's all like reenacted. But if you try the word reenaction, you could get different characteristics, and I'm not going to go into that. But I will say Orson Welles' Mercury Theater, along with Joseph Cotton, really did a lot of characterization for him and acting on screen for him. And they were with him like he was kind of this, like, demigod figure that was like guruing everybody about film. And like, it's not pretentious because he's only 25 years old when he makes Citizen Kane, okay? And then, like, they come up to him after he's 25, and he's got this whole huge crowd that already loves him. And he's like, didn't you guys hate my film? And, he's like confused. And they're like, no, we didn't hate your film. We like Citizen Kane. We saw it 3 times, and the third time it was good. He's like, so it's not good the first 2 times. And he's like tearing himself apart because he doesn't think anybody's going to like it. And like, he didn't know if it was any good when he didn't really get to see it in the screening room. But when it came out at the theater, when it came out, he's like kind of in the theater getting shaky about whether he should stay and watch it. But he seems to like some of it, and then his realization for the rest of his career that it failed as a movie and failed everybody is kind of in his mind, while there's like this cult following him around that's like, Citizen Kane is the best movie. There's no way there's anything better. Like when he dies at the end and the beginning, and it's like, okay, we get it. It's like Citizen Kane is the best movie ever, but we'll never underplay it being the best movie, is what I'm saying. We get it that it's the best movie, but to underplay that, there's no way to do that. Because, like, it pulls all the stops. Like, for instance, it's like you're racing on a racetrack and you have to shift really fast. That's kind of what the editing's like. It comes smoothing in right on top of each other, and it's not like one of those 1960s slide-ins, but those are cool. It's like the ones right here that like take it for balance on like a symmetrical shot. And like a symmetrical shot has 2 sides that are even somehow by the objectives in both sides, whether they're subjects. And whether they're subjects, you can like put one person next to another. And like, for instance, look at this cover. Okay, and we haven't gotten to this movie. We have to get through Macbeth next time. But we're actually drawing to the last 10 minutes of this class. And Lady of Shanghai is a discussion of when Orson Welles has a romance in his movies. It's one of those that's depicted as her being kind of this femme fatale. And a femme fatale is a film noir term for woman self-destructs and kills you, but that's not really what it means. And like, there's so many meanings of it that I'm just going to say that the negative connotation is gone by the time, of the band that plays about that. And then Lady from Shanghai, you're like, okay, there's Orson Welles being Irish, and there's this girl this woman who's like, he's falls for, and then the whole movie train wrecks. And it's always some woman that comes into his life, and he drinks with her, and then he smacks her around, and then he's like, I'm sorry, and then her world is ruined. And it's like this Orson Welles thing to have that in a movie. And I'm like, no wonder people didn't like it at first. The ending sucks because, like, you don't like to see things like that. But it's a damn good thing it isn't censored, though. Because if it was censored, it wouldn't be considered such a good film because they would take out the scenes that were most impactful and most like depicted of a woman's travails, even as a femme fatale, because a femme fatale could probably, come out as a widow, and then a femme fatale could also never really be taken under, because it comes from that Musadora tradition of Les Vampires with Irma Vep. Now, I know Irma Vep's a good character. Rita Hayworth and everything is already doing this kind of vamp style. That there's vamp style in Lady of Shanghai is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, there's like the Irish guy that's Orson Welles plays is always talking about like blood, and he's like getting all into it, and he's like saying it in these romantic ways. And he's couching it in these terms that you can't understand it. And I'm not just conspiratorializing over Orson Welles, because Orson Welles is one of those film historians, and he's always putting Nosferatu in his films. And like a couple of scenes, there's always a Nosferatu shot. Everybody has a Nosferatu shot in America. They're like, yeah, my Nosferatu is the president, or my Nosferatu is the president, And so, like, that Orson Welles plays this big, powerful monster in the background you can't see is, like, kind of weird because he is such a, like, relaxed film guru. Well, not to say relaxed. Because here's a guy who's running between all these theaters, goes to RKO, and now he's on his way to Macbeth and to Othello. And Othello has really a good, well done cinematic look to it. Its cinematography looks good. It frames around on the picture with a long take that follows Orson Welles for a little while up these stairs. But I really don't want to talk too much about it. Othello's a good movie, okay? It's well done Shakespeare. I mean, for Shakespeare on the screen, it's getting pretty good with Othello, you know? And that when Shakespeare worked with actors in Othello, he didn't really, I don't know if he was able to use, black people in the play. And but it was about a black dude back in the play, and that he's in Othello in all the versions of the African Americans ones, that movie, it's Othello. And Othello wasn't done by Orson Welles first. I think other actors that did, Shakespeare had done some Othello movies. And then there's been some since. But it seems to be the one that's problematic with blackface, and it doesn't make sense because Birth of a Nation and, some other movies had blackface jazz singer. And so now here you are with another historical movie with blackface, and you're like, why does this keep screwing it up? But that he worked with African Americans and Othello's about that, I really doubt he was all that racist, but that he played a black guy is kind of controversial, but that he was thinking that he was he would change his image to be think he's black just to see if he gets discriminated against. Well, that's kind of dumb. Can't you recognize that your friend is being discriminated against without going undercover? But I don't get that exactly. But I mean, maybe there is something to that, but it seems racist. But Orson Welles is not really apologetic for that because he has black friends, African American friends. He has them all over the city, in the acting community, in the acting houses. And still Othello goes down in flames. Only these are the flames you don't want to see, because it's great if you think about it as a boutique, Baccaroli shot, these movies. But I'm not underplaying the value of that film in terms of tracking shots either. Or the tracking shot that goes over and focuses on everything that Orson Welles is leaned up against, and it's this grand staircase. Again, but this time it doesn't go straight up like in The Stranger. Like in Othello, it's kind of this regular staircase, it's kind of weird seeing an Orson Welles movie, a regular staircase. No, I'm kind of joking, but the thing is not to make short of it, after The Stranger, when you get to Othello, trust me, if you're a hardcore Shakespeare buff, go ahead and see it. If you like Shakespeare's Othello, check it out. If you get mad at me because there's a blackface in it, don't say I didn't warn you. And the only thing I don't have against that is they're not really black, so it's kind of dumb that they put on black makeup because they're not really black. I mean, I hate to be the one to break it to everybody, but I didn't mean to tell Orson Welles he wasn't black, dude. I couldn't help but tell him, and I'm not black, so who am I? But I won't say what I am, but I'm just saying, And Orson Welles knew that about his own political party. He would get all caught up in these sort of director Illuminati gigs, like D.W. Griffith, he's passing on John Ford to Orson Welles, and it's the future of cinema is coming on, and it's all becoming this big Hollywood classical, huge monolith, and it's this monolith that divides into subdivided monoliths, and they're just there's so much to it, and so many people, but that it's a limited group of people in kind of an obscure space is a good idea, because then no one can really break up the party. And since they were breaking with Thomas Edison, even Griffith knew that you shouldn't break up the party. So as Orson Welles comes onto the scene, he is the party, only this time he brings democraticism with him. And democraticism ranges through Othello, even for Shakespeare, because it talks about how the populace are sometimes of a race that's unexpected to someone else. And you're like, well, how could a race be unexpected if you already knew it existed? But whatever, I guess we'll go along with that because I see the democratic point that there's a moral out in the group, and I see where Griffith went wrong with the democracy of Birth of a Nation. Isn't that democracy, though? I mean, I'm like, I don't know. But like, there's a lot of systems of democracy that are a lot more easier than that, or mainstream, that you can govern through the media and the look at the deconstruction of these other Hollywood monolith type places that did movies, these studio places. And they did these big movies that are kind of like plugged in to the whole atmosphere of like life all over the world. And they kind of just enter the atmosphere and life all over the world. And that's like this phenomenological experience that we have, that like the movie is born, and it's like, doesn't make it into a messiah complex, like someone I know would say. It doesn't make it into that, but that he doesn't really have that, but he gets totally destroyed and martyred for his own business in all of his movies. Is weird that at the end he's always dying for his business. Like even in The Third Man, when he's the villain, arch villain. And that's not his own movie directed, that's Carol Reed. We talked about that. So class, if you want to really look at The Stranger or Othello, trust me, they're outre, they're strange, they're even stranger than some of the ones he projected he'd make, Orson Welles. And I think you should probably check out Citizen Kane if you haven't seen it by now, just to see a great movie. And The Magnificent Ambersons, I recommend. We're coming at Macbeth next time, but there's more about Othello that I'll get at in these last few minutes. It's like Othello doesn't give a chance to the idea that there were African American actors at that time, that there were kind of blacklists going around at that time that took the element of African Americans out of the movie, was a strange notion to Orson Welles, and he didn't want any trouble with anybody, so he cast himself as Othello. And I thought, that happens again in history, but I won't say where and I won't say who. But it's like, if anyone in the postmodern era had done blackface, they'd have known it was like a negative symbol, or like a symbol of, lack of, like a symbol of like bad things going to happen because you see this blackface. And it's like this, not only, I hate the word vaudeville for this because it seems like a catch for all of where all this racism came from, but they did these big vignettes with like scenography that were big chunks of time and space with like animals and people, and sometimes people died and there was all kinds of crazy things. So blackface wasn't really even a notion of like what they could use for cinema, that it evolved to Orson Welles putting on makeup. I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, how do you feel about it? Do you feel that it was like kind of like another one of his projects that was like Inherit the Wind and he crashes at the end and can't prove it? It's like, in a good way, I like Inherit the Wind because Darwin wins. But and Orson Welles is always dying for his company, so it's like he's the last of the survivors, but last man standing by the end of his movies, And usually that's because he kills everybody else in the movie. Just his character kills their characters. And I'm not talking about the actors that played them, the actors that played the characters. But his character would kill all the other characters in like The Third Man by Carol Reed, and so you're like, this is like an Orson Welles movie. Because Orson Welles is killing everybody. And they're back. It's the Mercury Players, and they're all back alive in the next film. It's really a beautiful thing, this kind of independent filmmaking. It's one of those things that reminds you that when the director has full control, he can get his vision in the movie. He can get his vision in the movie to show the style and form off to audiences that expect a certain type of editing realism, where they don't notice the editing as much, and a certain like movement to the camera that's balanced as such that it travels in space just at the right time you need to see it. And if there isn't anyone that was trained on radio to do the same thing with audio, was Orson Welles. So in a minute, we're gonna go, but you guys need to know that it'll be about another week, give or take, that we do the next masterclass. This is number 4. Next week's number 5. I'll see you then. Bye.